Today let's work on wheat cables or wheat type cables for machine knitters, because from what I've seen it's really a family of similar cables, all of which have in common that they're symmetrical and they fan out from the center much like V cables, but there is a single stitch between the columns of stitches that move apart, like the stem of a sprig of wheat. That stitch is never moved. This is the very simplest version, and I'll show it to you first. Getting a little bit fancier, we can add 2 purl stitches, one on either side of that central column. They never move either, and they can be made either using the ribber or by reforming them after knitting them. That's what you'll see me do in this movie, but either one works just fine. So this becomes a little bit more realistic ear of wheat, but here is a more ultimate version. In the first 2 samples, I used stitches as pairs moving out from the center. You'll see that soon. In this case, they moved out as singles. We do use the central stitch with a purl stitch to each side, and as soon as there is room at the center, we begin moving another set of stitches apart at the same time as the first is still moving, making for a much more tightly fitted together wheat ear. This can also be done when moving out 2 stitches at a time, but of course it has to be a bigger motif for there to be room to do that. Any version may be also outlined with purl stitches. The stitches might be on the ribber, or you can reform them, as I have shown on the final sample. We begin by taking note of the center stitch and remembering to always leave that one alone. And to the left of center, pick up 2. And farther left of that, pick up a single. Move the 2 to the left, the single to the right, and replace them. Again, skip the center stitch, but take note of it. Now move 2 to the right in the foreground. Those that are replaced first will be cable stitches, and replace the background stitch last, and knit 2 rows. Now we do the same thing again, except the stitches keep moving progressively out, creating the illusion of the wheat ear. So we pick up the 2 that were replaced as a pair last time, move them out again, move the one to their left towards the center of the work, really the one outside of them is the way I like to think of it. Do the same thing on the right, and this time, because of the movement, there will be 3 untouched stitches at the center of the work. The group of stitches moved first is the foreground stitch or cable stitch or stitches. The background stitches are moved second, and they do keep in the background because of that. After every move, we knit 2 rows. So this is the very most basic version of the cable, and we just keep repeating it as wide as we wish, and beginning at the center every time, leaving that central stitch. A refinement, one step up, is to work the exact same cable, but leave 3 center stitches. One of them will remain a knit stitch, and the ones to either side will be purl stitches to further define the center core of the wheat stem. Those stitches may be placed on the ribber or reformed after the fact, as I'll do here. So here I'm just allowing for those 3 to be left alone, and I will reform the purl stitch after the fact because I'm working on a single bed machine. It is perfectly okay to put the stitch that comes on either side of center onto the ribber and leave it there if that's an option for you. Other than that change, the second sample works exactly as the first one did. We continually move pairs of stitches away from the center and stitches that began towards the outer edge of the work towards the center after moving the pairs to create the background stitches. Each pair is picked up from the position where it was left after the previous move and moved to a new position 1 stitch farther out. And to review, whichever stitches are moved first will appear as cable stitches in the foreground. Those that are moved second will be background stitches. When we've finished the vertical work, or at a certain point on the way there, if you're doing a whole sweater front, it's easier to stop and do this a couple of times. We drop and latch up the stitches we want to be purls. This can include just the stitches left and right of center, or it may also include one or more stitches to the left and right of the entire cable. For sample 2, I reformed only the stitches left and right of the central stock stitch. In a moment, we'll start on sample 3, which has a couple of changes involved. First of all, we're going to be moving the stitches out one at a time. As you join me, I've already knitted a few rows of it, and you can see where the last cross was made, which helps me determine where the next cross should be made just by looking at the fabric. I left 3 stitches in the center so that we have the central stock stitch plus a future purl stitch, since I'm working on a single bed machine, and I'm progressively moving the stitches out with 1/1 cables. Even if working from a chart, it's a good idea to always read the back of the fabric. Make sure you spot the last cross and move outward from it. When you count across between the stitches that are involved in a cable cross, there should always be an odd number remaining. When that number reaches 7, we can begin a new set of wheat leaves, what would I call those? Wheat seeds, moving out from center. We still have to leave those center 3 stitches alone, one for the stalk, one to each side of it for the purl stitch that sets aside the stalk. And then when we have 4 more, 2 to move out on each side, or 2 to make a moving cross on each side, so 7 stitches, we can start moving out from the center in the same row that we continued the previous pair moving out. Having multiple sets of stitches moving in the same row creates a more tightly nested set of V's, and it looks more reminiscent of the wheat ear that was the inspiration for the original design back in the dim mists of time. When any set of stitches reaches the outer limit that you've defined for the cable, knit 2 rows and just don't move it again. But you will still probably be moving an additional set of stitches continually outward. And as soon as there are 7 stitches in the center of the work, allowing for leaving 3 alone and crossing 2 to either side of it, you begin the next outward moving pairs of stitches. It's very, very simple and very, very repetitive, which is why, although a chart is a perfect representation of what's going on, it's so helpful to learn to read the fabric also. This does not have to be done only with single crosses. It could be more stitches moving out on the tool that is towards the center of the work. But more stitches, in order to get room to nest the outward moving V's more tightly, means there would need to be a wider motif entirely. That's fine. It's just something to consider when planning your work. How big do you want it to be? For baby clothes, multiple stitches moving might be too big. For a man's extra large sweater, it's perfect. Continue as long as you want the cable to be. It is traditional to have the outermost pairs of stitches reach the outer edge of the cable and call that a complete cable repeat before stopping. Now reform any stitches that are needed to set off the other parts of the cable. In this case, one on either side of center is defining the center stalk, and I'm also going to reform those on the outer edges of the cable for greatest dramatic effect. Just to repeat, if you're working with a ribber, there is no problem having those stitches that will become purl spend their entire lives on the ribbon. It is important in such a case that the size of the ribbon stitches and the knitter stitches match. This is something that you can predetermine by swatching. A great way to do it is by knitting a tube so that the main bed knits, ribbon knits, main bed knits, ribbon knits, and tweaking the stitch size until the halves of the tube match perfectly. So I will finish latching up, get this sample off the machine, and we'll give it one final close-up look. Because this cable actually involves rather small crosses, it doesn't pull in the fabric very much, therefore it's okay to add it as a center motif without resizing most sweater patterns. A very snugly fitted pattern you might need to. A typical one, you can just add this.